So without further ado, we're going to move into this amazing panel we have for you, which will bring us up until about lunchtime. The format of this panel, we have 4 speakers today. We're going to talk about really what's happening in the nation with medical cannabis laws. We're going to talk about everything from CBD-only laws and how they affect patients to national cultivation policy to getting a broad overview of what each state kind of looks like and their differences, maybe advantages, disadvantages, how ASA has rated these states in their medical cannabis policy, as well as some of the challenges that we see happening with patients in states where legal adult use laws are coming into place and kind of what's going on as we have dual markets in states. We did plan with these panelists to hopefully have a few minutes for question and answers towards the end of the panel. So as our speakers present, I would like to request that folks use the notepads on the table. If you have questions that come up, feel free to jot them down. In the final remaining moments of the panel, right, we will send around a couple staff people and you can hold up your questions, and then we will do our very best to answer them. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our first panelist, who will be Hunter Holloman. Hunter is currently the Chief of Staff for Americans for Safe Access. And after Hunter came to ASA through his involvement in the San Francisco chapter, he's been a patient in California for nearly a decade. He also has a background in dispensary work. He served on the San Francisco Medical Cannabis Task Force. And Hunter was kind enough to relocate to Washington, D.C. in late 2012 from California to work as ASA's National Field Coordinator and Chief of Staff. So Hunter Holloman.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning. My presentation today is on medical marijuana access in the U.S. We undertook a very ambitious project about a year ago, realizing that there were kind of a few different types of medical cannabis laws on the books out there. Now we have this proliferation of CBD, kind of affirmative defense laws, as well as the more traditional comprehensive distribution-based laws out there. And we needed a way to be able to compare these laws in the states kind of head to head, and it is kind of comparing apples to oranges a lot. Some have distribution systems, some have personal cultivation, some don't. So we essentially went through and created a matrix and graded every state, gave them a grade. And this map actually is a color-coded representation of how those grades graded out. You can see California, Maine, Colorado, the darker states have the better grades. So a little overview of the state of medical cannabis in the U.S. Of course, we are still having issues with federal laws. It is still federally illegal. We are currently at 23 states plus D.C. that have functional medical cannabis laws. Again, they have some sort of distribution system, in-state cultivation, et cetera. We now have, I guess, 13 states have CBD laws, and I believe we're going to be adding Georgia to that very, very shortly as soon as the governor signs. We also now have 4 states plus the District of Columbia that have passed full legalization adult use laws. So again, there are these different types of laws, and it makes it very, very hard to compare these programs to each other. But overall, 23 plus 13 and DC, that's 36 states plus DC that have passed some sort of medical cannabis law, CBD or otherwise, and that now incorporates over 2 million legal medical cannabis patients in the US. That is a ton, and very, very exciting. I also really like to use the big number 36 instead of just saying we have 23 medical states, because effectively these other CBD states have, they are indeed medical cannabis laws, and 36 just sounds so much better than 24. But it is awesome. It's very affirming. We're way past critical mass there. The majority of states have really stood up and said that this is something that they want to have available for their residents. So talking about the evolution of laws, there's kind of 3 different time periods that we talk about when we're talking about medical cannabis laws. Of course, in the 90s and early 2000s, with California and Arizona passing their first laws in 96, and kind of the rest of the Pacific Northwest passing their laws, those laws were really focused on criminal exemptions, just not arresting patients for using their medicine. That was kind of the first period of medical cannabis laws. The second really came around in the mid-2000s, where we start to see both criminal exemptions as well as distribution systems being introduced into law and through regulation. That was a great step forward. And now, as we as a community continue to evolve and mature, really starting in the early 2010s to present, we start to see the addition of product safety standards, making it into the laws and regulations. And that just seems like a natural evolution for where we want to be as we're, again, trying to mature as a community, mature as a cause. This is really adding a lot of legitimacy to the work that we're doing when we can say, we're not just talking about getting medicine to patients, we're talking about getting safe, tested medicine to patients. And that is a very, very important step. Of course, a lot of these product safety standards are based off of the APA standards. We have 4 standards, and I think that you'll be talking about them a little bit later. But the American Herbal Products Association published 4 different standards on distribution, cultivation, laboratory analysis, and manufacturing processing. And these are national best practice standards that have allowed us to really continue moving the ball forward on these product safety standards. And of course, we have the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia that has set some laboratory and identity standards as well. State-by-state grades, I mentioned that earlier when we were looking at the map. The criteria for these grades were actually determined through the last 4 or 5 years. Steph has just been traveling the country, traveling so much, but you may have noticed if she's come to your state, she's held like a town hall type meeting. And those are really kind of stakeholder input sessions where she gathers the consensus of the groups in attendance, and they talk about certain points, certain criteria that they really want to see. And so taking all of that data, we were able to put together an evaluation system based on 4 areas of criteria here. The first being patients' rights and civil protections from discrimination. Those include everything from reciprocity, organ transplants, affirmative defense, employment protections, access to medicine. The second category is really about do they allow personal cultivation? Do they have a distribution system? Are there dispensaries in place? Ease of navigation, of course, that's also very important when you're talking about a program. Are the forms available online? Is there a reasonable wait period for a patient from the time they get the recommendation to the time they actually get their card if they're in a state that requires an ID? And then also functionality. Similar to ease of navigation, but that includes some of the product safety standards as well. And here's an example of Maine. Of course, Maine was one of our highest scoring states. Very great example. You can see we have each kind of category laid out there, access to medicine, and we were able to basically take the averages of all these and put them up and assign them a final grade. And let me show you some of the final grades here. So again, this is how we were able to compare states to states. We really didn't get any A's. We didn't want to curve this system because we feel like there's always so much progress that can be made, and so you'll see the best grades that we actually gave are B's. Where are we? For Maine, Rhode Island, I think California is a B- right now. All of this is available in our report, which can be found on our website. It's safeaccessnow.org/medical marijuana access in the U.S. I guess we do need to update it now that we have some new CBD states coming on. If you see Virginia's not represented there, we're very excited for Virginia. That's awesome. And we'll have to be going through and grading Georgia This is a really fun project, but it's hard to keep up to date during the legislative session because states are just passing laws left and right, and then we have to go back and update it. But very excited to be able to fill in the rest of the map soon, hopefully. And then finally, I was going to speak very briefly about some new legislative trends that are kind of happening currently. There's both the good and the bad. The good, as we start to see some of these new states come online, there is more of a focus on civil protections, which are absolutely important: employment discrimination, CPS protections, family law protections, which is excellent. We need to be, putting the patient's safety first. There's also this focus on product and consumer safety. We're seeing that written into both statute and regulations. It's awesome, great step forward. We're also seeing, these national standards being incorporated into the law and regulation. And finally, we're seeing these newer laws are what we consider robust regulatory schemes. And I borrowed that word from the Cole memo, but it's really, there's a few different camps. There's those that like regulation, and there's those that don't like regulation. The government has come forward and said that they want to see these robust regulatory schemes to keep the federal intervention at a minimum. So we are starting to see, Illinois' regulations, I think, are like 150 pages. They're just so extensive. But if that keeps the Department of Justice out of the state, then that's okay. Some of the bad legislative trends that we're seeing, we're really starting to see this weird shift away from personal cultivation in statutes. And there's been so much focus on distribution schemes within states, licensing cultivation centers, licensing labs, licensing processors, licensing dispensaries. But we're really, unfortunately, kind of moving away from personal cultivation, which is something that ASA would not like to see happen. We're also starting to see this proliferation of CBD affirmative defense laws, both with and without distribution schemes. There's a few of those 13 that I mentioned earlier that actually do have a distribution scheme, but haven't been implemented yet. Missouri and Florida being two examples of that. And then lastly, the bad is we're starting to see this limiting access to whole plants or smokables. Minnesota was really the first law passed that was similar to this, where you don't have access to whole plant. You can't buy flowers through a dispensary. And then New York followed up shortly after that. I guess Governor Cuomo was really impressed with Minnesota's law and decided that they were just going to stick to extracts, edibles, concentrates, and vaporizables. But this is, again, not a type of medical program that we like to see. We, of course, advocate that everyone has access to whole plant medicine and not restricting delivery methods as well, because we all know that vaporizing is much better, but there are certain instances where you need to be able to smoke cannabis to treat your conditions. So those are my legislative trends. And again, for more information, we have all this up on our website. Check it out. Go see how your state matches up. Check out the grades. And if you do have any questions, feel free to come ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. Our next speaker, Mr. Martin Lee, is going to talk to us today about CBD-only laws and some of the consequences of those laws. Martin is the director of Project CBD, an educational service that focuses on cannabis science and therapeutics. He is the author of Smoke Signals, a social history of marijuana, medical, recreational, and scientific, winner of the American Botanical Council's James A. Duke Award for Excellence in Botanical Literature. And Martin Lee is also co-founder of the media watch group FAIR, which stands for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, as well as the author of Acid Dreams and The Beast Reawakened. So without further ado, please welcome Martin Lee.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting Project CBD to participate in this. Thanks for everybody coming. Fred Gardner and I co-founded Project CBD about 5 years ago with the encouragement and help of Dr. Jeffrey Hergenrather of the Society of Cannabis Clinicians. And at that time, there was very little knowledge of cannabidiol, CBD, even within the medical marijuana community. And we spent much of our time focusing as an educational organization, trying to communicate the message that, cannabis and THC aren't identical. There's a lot more going on in cannabis than just the THC. And these days, ironically, we're inundated with requests for information from all over the world. And I find myself in the position, more often than not, in telling people, it's not just all about CBD. There's a lot more going on in cannabis than just CBD. Now, I first learned about CBD when I was covering the cannabis science beat as a journalist, along with Fred Gardner. We would attend regularly the annual conferences of the International Cannabinoid Research Society, very impressive gatherings, difficult for a layperson. I'm not a scientist. But I was quite taken by what I was hearing. It was really jaw-dropping, the information I was learning at these conferences, and we felt as journalists it was our job to try to communicate this information in a way that would be accessible to people who aren't scientists, to doctors, to patients, to others. And we hear a lot about CBD and all kinds of things, and much of the research that the findings that we were learning about were based on preclinical research, animal studies, test tubes, petri dishes, not human studies, but very impressive nonetheless. And it was clear that CBD as a molecule, as a single molecule, because that's what was mainly being studied, was a very, very potent molecule with a lot of potential to address a wide range of conditions, not just epilepsy, not just cancer and pain, but things like diabetes, mad cow disease, believe it or not. There was cardiac arrhythmia. That the CBD showed potential for all kinds of conditions. At the Project CBD website, projectcbd.org, we list 50 on the homepage, and with the scientific data to back that. But Fred and I, we would talk after these conferences, and we'd shake our head and say, wow, wouldn't it be great if this stuff was available in California, which is where we're from, because it wasn't available. It wasn't part of the medical marijuana mix. Then when it became available, as a result of the analytical labs emerging, being able to test the strains and the promiscuous interbreeding that would go on with these strains, and lo and behold, a few would pop up with what we called CBD-Rich, that either had more CBD than THC, or maybe just enough to qualify. We put an arbitrary number of 4% CBD by dry weight. Well, right away we sensed that this could be very significant, the fact that these were now available in Northern California, these strains and the products that would be made from them. And significant not only in terms of the potential to help a lot of people and to bring a lot of new people into the medical marijuana community, because CBD, as you know, is not psychoactive like THC is. So if people are not comfortable with getting high from marijuana, still could access the benefits of medical marijuana, depending on the strain or product, if it had a significant amount of THC and, CBD mixed with the THC. But we also sensed at the time that CBD, not just as a potent medicine, but could be potent political medicine. There could be a tool for political change in policy. This is back now in 2009, 2010. We hadn't even had the vote for legalization in California that was defeated. We also, I recall the conversations. We were wondering how the pretzel logicians in the drug czar's office would handle this phenomenon. What are they going to say about a plant that, how are they going to disparage and denigrate a CBD-rich cannabis plant? I mean, you can't even say that, the fallback position is that it gets you high and that's bad. They can't even say that necessarily. So what would they do? Well, we predicted that the framework would be CBD would emerge as the good cannabinoid. THC would continue to be demonized as the bad cannabinoid. And that's indeed what's happened. And so when you marry those two factors together, the good cannabinoid versus bad cannabinoid framework, with the sense that CBD is potentially very powerful, it can actually change policy maybe. What do you get? You get CBD-only laws. I put this together Thursday already. It's outdated because Georgia would have to color in. And as Hunter indicated, these laws vary somewhat. I won't go into all that, other than to say that we don't feel at Project CBD that these laws adequately serve the patient population. But we also are sensitive to the fact that for some people, if they can manage to access a CBD-rich strain like the Charlotte's Web or the ACDC, which is very little THC in it, and it helps them, that's great. We don't want to stand in the way of that by any means. But there's a lot of problems in this context, and some of the problems we outlined in our report, Hemp Oil Hustlers, which we published last October and revised in November. And I'm not going to go into the report in great detail. People are welcome to read it. It's posted on the Project CBD website. It's a long report, more than 10,000 words, and we stand by every word in that report. But suffice it to say that the problems for patients go beyond just the lack of access, even in the CBD-only states, so-called. And CBD-only is a bit of a misnomer. Probably better to say low THC states than CBD-only states, or if you want to be cynical about it, you could say the keep marijuana illegal states. That's one way of looking at it. It's probably all true, all of the above. But again, it's nuanced. It's not quite black and white. But the FDA recently issued these 11 warning letters criticizing some of these many companies that are sprouting up in the internet for making false medical claims or unproven medical claims. There's a lot of other things the FDA could have criticized about the labeling, which they did not yet. They didn't take a position about the legality of CBD. And these are all questions that are controversial. But I think that in terms of our report, which documented some of the questionable financial practices of Medical Marijuana Inc. and some of the problems with the products that we sampled showing toxic solvent residues, that's all significant. But to me, the most important thing about the report went beyond any specific company, went beyond Medical Marijuana Inc. And because it posed the question to us, is industrial hemp really a viable source of CBD, the way it's being portrayed? And what we concluded by looking into this and interviewing a lot of people is that there are some inherent problems, because there's not the cannabinoid profile in industrial hemp generally is not as robust as with cannabis. With the ACDC strain, for example, you'll get 18% CBD by dry weight. And in the industrial hemp strains, from 3.5%, 4% maybe maximum the CBD. So what it means is you need an awful lot of plant material to extract from to get a little bit of CBD. And because hemp is a bioaccumulator, a phytoremedial plant, it sucks up poisons from the soil, which is great if you want to repair soil, but not so great if you're going to make a medicine out of it, because it concentrates the toxins in that process. And that to us was significant. And that factor was openly acknowledged by some key players in the industry. And where this is all going, as far as we can see, is and what's being marketed now by some companies, including this biosynthesis pharma group, then hemp diol, is this pure CBD powder, or what they claim is. And the reason why, one of the reasons is that because they have to deal with the fact that the phytoremedial capabilities of hemp. If they can make a very pure powder out of it, they don't have to worry about the toxins, the heavy metals, the solvent residues, et cetera. And they claim that this is a 98% pure powder. We tested some of it, doesn't rate that high in some of the products we looked at. And I don't mean to cast aspersions against these particular companies. I just want to say that this is where it's going. And it's driven in part by commercial imperatives. If you want to get around the law, so to speak, you can't have THC, so great, this is perfect. And it's going to be, they claim, pretty inexpensive, although one day we got a call at Project CBD. It came from out of the country, and we looked in it, so I answered the call. And a few minutes into the conversation, I couldn't get at what he wanted, really. I said, what are you seeking from Project CBD? How can you help? And the caller, who I won't identify, and it's nobody from either of these groups, said, well, we have a kilo of pure CBD. We'd like you to help us sell it. I said, a kilo of pure CBD? I was kind of silent on the phone. We get a lot of requests from patients about how can I help my loved one. They have this. We don't get these kind of requests usually. So it was a pause, and then I said, well, how much are you asking for it? I sort of a journalistic kind of question. $65,000 a kilo, but for you, we'll give it to you for $60,000. So I said, I don't think that's part of our mandate, really, to be doing this. It's not part of our bylaws as a nonprofit, but anyway. But it is being driven by both the commercial concerns and the concerns about the quality of the product. So further along this line of the pure CBD, because this is the obsession, the idea is if CBD is good, pure CBD would be better, it would be great. And that's the logic, well, here's a company, Insys, it's publicly traded, it's not a penny stock, it's not on the pink sheets. And this was an article in a journal called Cannabis Pharma Journal. Mercifully, I should say, it's defunct. It was a terrible journal. And the title reads, Insys Therapeutics Analysis shows Insys synthetic CBD, the pure CBD, is chemically identical to the plant-derived CBD. Amazing. CBD is identical to CBD. Isn't that amazing? Well, that's what they showed, and that's worth an article. The real comparison, of course, and I'm going to get into that, is comparing not the CBD, pure CBD molecule from one source to a pure CBD molecule from another source, but comparing the pure CBD to the whole plant CBD-rich cannabis. That's the comparison. How do each of them work? So, okay, another slide here before we get into that comparison. This is a quote from NIDA Director Nora Volko. You want to get as pure a medication as you can to minimize side effects. And she's looking particularly freaky, holding a brain. And by the way, see, this is what happens when you don't smoke marijuana. And there's a direct I don't want to say causation. You can't say causation, but there seems to be a association between not smoking marijuana and being paranoid about losing control, which is why she said in an interview she wouldn't try it. She's afraid of losing control. Apparently, she hasn't watched much TV. Have you ever seen a drug commercial for a pharmaceutical that doesn't list all the side effects? These are the pure drugs that she's so enamored with. It's just the opposite. But and so the point is that this whole idea of the obsession with purity, I think is moving in the wrong direction. And we heard yesterday from panelists who said when you're looking at the tryptophan and they made it even a little bit purer from 98 to 99%, it screwed up everything and killed people. And this idea that the pure is better, I think we have to look at very carefully. So I want to now focus on this recent report in Pharmacology and Pharmacy. It's a science journal from last month. It has the rather unwieldy title of Overcoming the Bell-Shaped Dose Response of Cannabidiol by Using Cannabis Extract Enriched in Cannabidiol. Written about the report, it's in the preview issue of Shaughnessy's, so you can, I consider this a very important article, really, a very important report, because it did compare on a therapeutic level how a pure synthetic CBD, how it faced up with a CBD-rich cannabis strain in Israel called Avidecal, which is the same as ACDC in California and other states now. Avidecal measures 17.9% THC, and the ACDC, we always say it's 18%. As far as I could tell, it's really the same exact strain with different names, both originating in Spain, a phenotype of what they call the canatonic strain, which is not meant to be a play on catatonic. Cannabis tonic is what it meant. And anyway, just to very quickly sum up what this article said, they found that, and it's a very prestigious team, incidentally, of researchers who authored that article. They found that the pure CBD molecule, when the rats were exposed to it, and they were looking at three factors: inflammation, pain, perception, tumor necrosis factor, alpha, which is a kind of a systemic signaling molecule for inflammation. And when they gave the mice, or the rats, I don't remember, the pure CBD, they found it was effective, but only at a very, very narrow point. You see, where did it go? Here. There was a very narrow therapeutic band that was effective at high doses required. But if you undershot the mark or overshot the mark slightly, it wasn't effective at all. That was the pure CBD. And when they compared it to the CBD-rich cannabis strain, it didn't have this bell-shaped curve. It had a kind of, the more the cannabis extract, and it was an oil extract they were using, you gave, the more it would have a therapeutic effect. So it was a direct relationship until it reached a certain peak point, and then it would kind of plateau. That's what they found. And it was very clearly concluded in the report, maybe we'll read that, that the plant was better than the single molecule. And what it said here, if I might, I'll just read this. This is the concluding paragraph from this, what I think very significant article. A lot of research has been made to isolate and characterize isolated single constituents of traditional herbal medicine to find their rationale for therapeutic uses. However, our data, together with those of others, provide legitimation to introduce a new generation of phytopharmaceuticals to treat diseases that have hitherto been treated using synthetic drugs alone. The therapeutic synergy observed with plant extracts results in the requirement of a lower amount of active components with consequent reduced side effects. So the more single molecule you get, the more side effects you tend to get, just the opposite of what Nora Volko was saying. And the synergy, of course, is key here because we know from a lot of research that CBD alone does not work as well as CBD combined with THC in terms of for many therapeutic applications, and then vice versa, that you need some kind of a mix. What's confusing to a lot of people is what are the ratios and what kind of mix you actually need. So let's see, I have to do it this way. All right. I want to talk just for a moment by way of a conclusion about the situation in California, because it's quite different in California. We don't have problems with access, in the way that folks in North Carolina and Virginia and other CBD-only so-called states have. We are not confined to limited choices. We don't have to order through the internet our medicine, and I don't think in general that's a good way to get medicine, through the internet, irrespective of what the product is. But because in California, we have many choices if you're a medical marijuana patient. And from the perspective of a producer, we don't have to market to all 50 states being allegedly legal, which it's not, because in California you have a huge market. If you just marketed there and were successful as a business, that would be great. You combine all the other states together, you wouldn't reach the market of California. But in California, I think that the battleground, and I don't like to speak in militaristic terms, but it's what's going to happen after legalization passes, if it does in 2016. I shared Alice O'Leary's concerns about the deep-rooted bigotry toward all things cannabis, that it's so deeply implanted in the culture that I don't take it as a given, although I seem to be the black sheep among all my friends in California who assume it's just going to pass in 2016. Okay, for the sake of the conversation, let's say it does. I certainly hope it does, and I would certainly vote for it. So what's going to be the fate of the medical marijuana experiment, this great laboratory experiment in democracy that has been unfolding in California since before 1996, actually, before Proposition 215 was passed? What's going to happen to the medical marijuana? How is it going to be regulated in an era of adult use being legal? And that is a major concern, and I think it's a major concern of people on this panel and the folks at AZA, and I have to commend AZA's strategy of focusing on framing the discussion in terms of cannabis being a medicinal herb, and that's how it should be regulated, not as a pharmaceutical, not as a single molecule, not as an isolated compound, but as a plant, and you have many medicinal plants. And it's in that context. Hopland, just to give the context, if you're going up 101, traveling north over the Golden Gate Bridge, through Marin, through Sonoma County, then you enter Mendocino County, and that's one of the three counties that form the fabled Emerald Triangle, which is the cannabis breadbasket of the United States. It's the cannabis heartbeat. This is where the homegrown started back in the 70s, and it's a region that should be honored, and there are many people in that region who have been involved in this industry for quite a while who are very concerned about what legalization will mean for them. So we were originally approached at Project CBD by a fellow named John Schaefer, who runs a business called Real Goods and a nonprofit called the Solar Solar Living Institute, and is based in Hopland. And Hopland is the first town across the border into Mendocino. It's where 101 narrows into a two-lane road, and where we envision, after legalization, it'll be the first stop that the cannabis tour buses will stop. And it'll be at this particular place, at the Real Goods Solar Living Institute, which will also have a medical marijuana dispensary as a result of them reaching out to Project CBD. They suggested that we would do a, whoops, I'm going to show that. They wanted to do a CBD dispensary. And we said, well, you know, we're not too hot on the idea of just CBD. We're into the whole plant. And if you're interested in that, that's something we could see implementing. And this is a wonderful piece of property here. It's all off the grid, numerous solar panels. And what they want to do is, and we're actually moving forward with this project. We've contracted, and they're actually building things there now. We will have what we call a CBD-oriented dispensary, and by that we mean just a wider range of different products and strains, not just CBD, not just THC. And there'll be demonstration gardens available for people to see. There'll be tissue culture clones. We're working a lot with tissue culture now in Northern California, organic grow supplies. I won't read all the things, but one thing that I'm excited about is to have on this property, when people come to see what the medical marijuana experience in California really has been, that there would be also a native medicinal plant garden. We need that because there's a drought, so we want the native plants so they can survive the drought there. But a lot of different medicinal plants, and to present cannabis in that context of one plant, one medicinal plant among many. And there'll also be a cannabis museum on the property, which we will honor this particular region that has been so important in terms of it's germinating this cultural revolution, which is winning. Wellness is winning, right? So, and to honor what happened with Proposition 215 and how this is really, so much is what's happening in the rest of the country really started here. So that when people come up to visit cannabis country, this is what they're going to be presented with. We're going to present a picture which we think will maybe change some minds, and certainly we want to we see this as a way of advancing the efforts to understand cannabis as a medicinal herb and understand that's how it should be regulated. We feel it should be descheduled, not put into Schedule 2, but it's a step-by-step process, and we're hoping that if we put the best foot forward, sort of the best face forward for what is great about Northern California, the great cannabis, the entrepreneurial spirit, and so forth and so on, that this is a good way, this is a good face to put forward for if we in fact do legalize. So I'll leave it at that, and we welcome your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Martin. I just wanted to make a note here, too, that if you haven't received or haven't purchased and read a copy of Smoke Signals, you can get them in the bookstore. And tomorrow morning, Martin Lee will be out there signing folks copies of Smoke Signals for them. Our next speaker, Ms. Carrie Boyder, is going to talk to us about the bitter pill to swallow and why legalization in Washington state could come at the expense of patients. Carrie works with Americans for Safe Access as our legislative analyst and is based in Washington state. Prior to advocacy, which she has done a tremendous amount of advocacy work on medical cannabis, she spent 3 years in the Washington state legislature and enjoyed a successful career as a broadcast journalist. Over the course of the past 18 months, Carrie has been very busy in Washington, working on legislative proposals and introducing several legislative proposals within the legislature. Sorry, I got really tongue-tied on that one. In 2013, ASA named Carrie the National Medical Cannabis Advocate of the Year for her work in public outreach on behalf of federal defendants facing lengthy mandatory minimum sentences for their participation in medical marijuana laws. So I'm really excited to have Carrie talk to us about the future of patients. Please welcome Carrie Boyder.
Thank you, Kristen. It's an honor to be up here with such wonderfully intelligent panelists. So I've had a lot of people ask me already this weekend, we've heard Washington is really messed up. Is it honestly that bad? And my answer is yes and no. It's not that bad now. Right now, it's similar to California, where patients have the freedom of choice. And so there may be some people who don't provide the level of products that we would all like, and then there are those that provide excellent service, very safe products, tested on a level, and patients are able to just choose which places they're going to support. There's more than enough to go around, and so access is not infringed in any way. But we're looking at passing a proposal this year that's going to change all of that significantly. And I'm very concerned that pretty grave harm will be done to patients, and many will go without their medicine altogether, and others will just have to, restrict the amount they're using and go back onto pharmaceuticals, which is not a good proposition for them. So the question is, how did it get this way to where Washington, that was a leader in all of this medical marijuana movement, is now looking at restricting its laws to the point of going backwards? So we started in 1994 with the legislative proposal, right around the same time as California. So really, California was the pioneer, and Washington was right alongside with them. And in '98 is when we passed our voter initiative, and that was the second state in the nation to do so. So we've been leading for quite a while. We had, at the time, even before our medical marijuana law passed, a place called Green Cross Patient Co-op. Joanna McKee is a wonderful pioneer. And so if you think about the green crosses that you're seeing all around the country and how that's become a sign that's ubiquitous with medical marijuana, that was Joanna McKee's co-op. That was one of the original patient co-ops. And that was how patients got medicine before we had access. From there until 2008, 10 years really, there was no major restrictions or changes to the state medical marijuana law, which is an indication to me that there wasn't really any problem, because if there was, the legislature would have jumped right on that bandwagon to fix it. And in 2008 is when the first time they started to put some parameters around the law happened, and that was the 60-day supply. And it had happened when people were getting pulled over, or raids were happening in their homes. The question was, what's really a 60-day supply? And so the legislature took input from all sorts of people. Wonderful papers were written, extensive papers by Dr. Greg Carter and Sunil Agarwal, who's here as well. And using that information, the best science that we had at the time, they determined that 15 plants and 24 ounces constituted a 60-day supply. And that has been a model that a lot of other states have followed. It is, at the time, it was the most anybody could possess in the nation, but there are now other states that do that as well. And certainly, we always want to be moving forward with our laws and getting more, not having less. So I don't see that 24 ounces and 15 plants as being a bad thing. So then what happened was we decided to try to create a regulated dispensary system in 2011. And our legislature passed it, bipartisan bill, and it would have created dispensaries as well as protected that non-commercial patient-to-patient cooperative like Green Cross Patient Co-op was. And that went through, and then the governor got it to their desk and asked for the opinion of the U.S. attorneys, who said that we have the right to arrest your state employees for implementing this program. So the governor got a little freaked out about that, vetoed 38 out of 56 sections, and we're here where we are today, where dispensaries technically are not legal. And since they're not legal, there are no regulations to follow, because what the governor vetoed was anything involving licensing, registration, anything that involves a state employee touching cannabis. So all of our businesses between 2011 and now that existed already have stepped up in the absence of complete guidance to regulate themselves. And that's in varying levels of how they're doing that. Some are, like I said, at this level, and others still have a ways to go, but considering no guidance at all, they've done a pretty good job. And so, once 502 passed, which was the legalization initiative, that kind of changed things. And we were told all throughout the campaign, this is not going to impact patients, it's not designed to impact patients, this will not impact the law at all. And so many of us supported it, knowing that we're just trying to move forward the laws for everybody. We want all cannabis consumers to have access to this. But unfortunately, what happened is that as this program has started to become implemented, it is more regulated than our medical marijuana program, technically, because it has a state license and it has certain parameters it needs to follow. And as these businesses have put an enormous investment into that, they have started to say, now wait a minute, this isn't a level playing field here. These people don't have to follow regulations, they don't have to get licenses, they don't have to pay $10,000 fees, seed to sale tracking, and how are we supposed to compete? What they didn't talk about was the tax that's really why they can't compete. And the taxes have become a big part of this conversation because as we're looking at, I-502, the regulated model being something that could work for medical, there are certain things that just don't work, and the tax is one of them. With the taxes, right now the way the structure works is that in the legal market, it's taxed 25% from producer to processor, 25% from processor to retailer, 25% from retailer to consumer, and then a 10% sales tax on top of that. So you can see where there's not a whole lot of room for your business margin left at the end of the day. And then when you take in the account of 280E and the IRS and that you cannot deduct any of the other costs, these people in 502 are just barely squeaking by, if anything. And another part of the problem there is that it was all restricted to in-state investors only, and there's only so many of those. So what's happened is a lot of the medical marijuana pioneers who really stepped out and put their neck out on the line, they've had to actually spend their life savings to invest in this new market because there was no investors left for them. All the investors came to people who are new in the industry, new and exciting, So the biggest problem I would say with that market is that we have to fix the tax because as long as you have something that's taxed 25% compound on 3 levels plus 10%, the prices are going to be astronomical, and it doesn't matter how many patients you shove into that market, people are still going to go to the actual illicit market, not the gray market or now the black market as we're called. The really, truly illicit market, there will always be a demand as long as the supply side is not being met. So what they've said is, okay, well, we're going to move you into this 502 system, so we'll just go ahead and collapse the taxes to one level, and it'll be 30% passed directly onto the consumer, of course, which the consumer being patients in our case. And that should be good enough, right? We can't possibly have more than a 10% differential in price. We'll exempt you from sales tax, but not the excise tax. And so just to do the math on that for you, the prices in a retail store are about $50 an eighth, all the way up. And so at $200 a half, with the 30% tax, you're looking at $260 for a half. And then you add another 10% sales tax on top of that. Now you're talking $283 for one half of medicine. That's not very much for a patient. And for a casual user, maybe that's absorbable. But for a patient who at the end of the month is already deciding, am I going to pay my light bill or am I going to get my medicine, that's just not an option. So the other big things that come into play are, should the Liquor Control Board be overseeing all of this? And what's been interesting about that is that it's not just the dispensaries that they're trying to oversee. They want to oversee a large part of the patient population. They want to oversee some parts of the doctors. And actually, the latest thing is that research licenses are going to be given out by the Liquor Control Board. So just recognize what a slippery slope that is when you open the door towards the Liquor Control Board being the agency. Obviously, my personal opinion is it's not appropriate. We are not liquor, this is medicine. We're not doing this for fun, we're doing this for wellness. And there's a huge difference in things that go on with that. And the appropriate agency is Department of Health, like medicine is regulated by. Another huge thing about the 502 system is the products. There's 10 milligrams per serving caps and a maximum of 100 milligrams per product. So a typical patient uses somewhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams, and you're looking at anywhere from 10 to 50 products in the 502 stores. Now, they don't have topicals, transdermals, sublinguals, tinctures, they don't have beverages, they don't have raw cannabis juice, they don't have full extract cannabis oil or RSO. So what they do have is, I could have essentially, for me to get my 500 to 1,000 milligram dose, I would need to have 2 large containers of honey every day. I would need to drink eat 3 bottles of POW BHO capsules, 3 entire bottles. I would need 4 chronic tonics and 10 rum canna truffles. So I don't know how that is medicine or how that's going to contribute to my wellness, but something is really mixed up, and we're going to have to change that if patients are going to go into that system. Never mind the fact that there's no standard operating procedures for the labs in this system, which is where all sorts of problems are creeping up. So if we're going to talk about it being more tested in the 502 system and that being appropriate for patients, then we need to start looking at those types of things, as well as the sample size that they're using. We're not getting real relative samples, and some other things like that. And we've also been looking at this new discussion of the ban on whole plant products. Because what the real end goal is that these 502 business owners who've been influencing this process very heavily, actually they have 15 lobbyists to R1. So they basically see us all as dollar signs, and with high volume use is more business in their doors, and that's all good for them. So they don't want to see anybody having access to whole plant because they should come to their stores. They don't want to see us having concentrates, we should come to their stores. Anything above and beyond the very basic needs, which even they've qualified it as, you know, high CBD, low THC, we could have. So all of a sudden now Washington, that's a pioneer, is looking at these restrictions that essentially make us CBD only. And one of the biggest things is what they're doing to the doctors. I've talked to a lot of the doctors, and essentially I can't find one who would be able to continue to recommend cannabis under this new system. What it's requiring is that the doctors would enter onto the authorization how much they're going to recommend and the exact type of product that needs to be used. And that is actually a direct violation of very clear dictates under the Conant decision. So these doctors are saying, okay, it's one thing for me to have this private conversation, it's a whole different thing for me to put it on a paper and then send that into the government and actually go so far as to give them access, it says right in the bill, send the records to the, quote, disciplining authority. So it just seems like a recipe for disaster to me. And then there's the cultivation issues. They want to remove us from 15 plants down to 4 plants, from 24 ounces down to 6 ounces. They're actually trying to repeal 8 entire sections of our medical marijuana law, including our affirmative defense. When I started this, if you had told me I would no longer be arguing for arrest protection and I would just be trying to save affirmative defense, I would have thought you were crazy. And that's where Washington's at right now. And there's all sorts of other issues. There's buffer zones, 1,000 foot between businesses, and when you're somebody who has mobility challenges and takes public transit, there's actually a 1,000-foot buffer for public transit. So you're gonna have to go the distance of 3 football fields to get to your medicine. That's not acceptable in a medical scenario. There are some really good things happening in Washington. PTSD just passed the Senate by a vote of 48-0 unanimously. So there's some sense and some reason. There's another bill, Cannabis Health and Beauty Aids, that's kind of groundbreaking. It would actually remove cannabis health and beauty aids from the Controlled Substances Act completely in Washington, a different way of legalizing things. And it actually defines these products for the first time in the legal lexicon as below 0.3%, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, non-ingestible, and a couple other key things, so that, you know, there's a very clear line where these things are actually not intoxicating, they're not marijuana even, really, in the scope of what regulators think of as marijuana. And then there's some great movement on hemp, and actually another really interesting bill that's not specific to medical marijuana is about the doctor-patient relationship. It would stop employers from infringing on what doctors can and cannot do. And so that's actually done in terms of death with dignity as well as reproductive rights. It absolutely applies to cannabis, because how many places do you know that can't recommend cannabis because their employer says, no, we have a blanket policy against it? And I just want to kind of look at moving forward together, how to move forward. And I think when you look at legalization, it means different things to different people. To some people, it means tax and regulate. To other people, it means an unrestricted, free market access, grow it in my backyard, and it's not legal until you have that. For me, it means we don't sacrifice any of the legal rights that we have now. We only get more. We expand our rights. We expand our access. Anything less is not legalization, it's more prohibition. And certainly, patients should not have to bear the biggest burden of everyone. We shouldn't have to suffer to make legalization work. We want to still partner and move forward together. There's tons of work still left to do. You heard about employment and housing. Children are still being taken, organ transplants, and denial of other medical care, veterans, PTSD, cultivation for all. We still have to move forward on this, and until every single prisoner is released, it's not legal either. So, if you want to know what you can do right now, if you're in a state that's looking at legalization, the number one thing I would tell you is regulate, regulate, regulate. That is the key difference between Colorado and Washington. Colorado regulated their medical first and had a great foundation to build on. We're now trying to squeeze into a market that's just completely inappropriate. So if there's anything you can do right now, it's work as hard as you can to regulate this industry now so that when new investors come in, you're no longer the untested, the unsavory, the untaxed part of the market.
Thank you, Carrie. So I'm the last presenter on this panel, so we aren't quite there for questions yet, so sorry. And hopefully we'll get to it, but I am going to talk a little bit about farming, the farming of medical cannabis in the United States. And I'm specifically using the term farming because that's what we're talking about here, right? Cannabis is a crop that's produced for human consumption. We've heard a lot about whole plant medicine, and this is where it comes from, right? It comes from the farm. So I'm going to change up some of the terminology. We're going to talk about farms, we're going to talk about gardens, and we're going to kind of drop the grower lingo. So preparing for this, cultivation trends in the U.S., I don't have a lot of really great things to say about them, so I'll try not to be too much of a Debbie Downer in this presentation. But what I did is I went through the ASA's state report and I went through this grade card. And in section 2 of the grade card, when we talk about access to medical marijuana, ASA was really gracious and they rated the states as far as what they did to provide personal cultivation and whether or not they provided or allowed for caregivers to collectively cultivate. Personal cultivation had a maximum of 25 points. Collective cultivation was offered 10 points. So combined, they had the total opportunity for 35 points. So I went ahead and made, there's the explanations. We'll skip through those, sorry. So I went ahead and made my own version of a state report card. Yeah, it is colored pencils, and we can thank my daughter for that. So, one thing I wanted to point out, I'm a really visual person, so for me, this was really helpful in kind of seeing what our patients' cultivation rights and caregiver cultivation's rights truly look like across the U.S. So, states like California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado that are purple, they got A's, right? And we can debate what that means in the next few slides. But as far as what's relative to the rest of the United States, they have A's. The blue states are B's. The pink states are C's. Alaska and Rhode Island, with the stripes, they have D's, and all of these red states failed. They just failed to allow for personal cultivation, and they failed to allow for collective cultivation, which means really, ultimately, largely, they're failing in access to patients in many ways. So moving on, I took these A states and I said, well, let's really look at what makes a state an A, right? And so California, which, I have some differing opinions, Martin, about how fabulous California is, but from a cultivation perspective, it's, I won't say any naughty words, but it's a little backwards. California doesn't have a statewide regulatory system, very similar to what we see in Washington. And so California's allowances for plant limits or square footage, which it varies as to whether it's a square footage or plant limit based rule or regulation in California for cultivation, it varies by county. Within each county, it may vary again, according to the incorporated city that you're in. And the thing about California, it doesn't really technically say you can only provide for X number of patients, so that's pretty good. And it does allow for both indoor and sun-grown medicine, so you can cultivate indoors and you can cultivate outdoors. Oregon allows for 6 mature plants. You can cultivate for up to 4 patients, and you can grow indoors or outdoors. Washington has this 15 plants per patient. Technically, you can cultivate for 10 patients, but you can't exceed 45 plants, so it's kind of weird. And you can cultivate indoors and outdoors. And then Colorado is this whopping 3 mature plants per patient, and you can have 3 immature plants. And localities can also further restrict in Colorado, just like in California. And the thing with Colorado, they really can't have an A, because they only allow indoor. So California farming facts, right? Because California, we talk about it being the leader in cultivation, having this really liberal ability for sun-grown cultivation to happen, the Emerald Triangle, the breadbasket of cultivation in the US. And, well, again, we have no statewide regulatory guidelines, puts a lot of farmers at risk. When I looked at the counties here, because I was hoping to do another color pencil map, you guys don't get that today. I looked at 58 counties. 29 out of the 58 counties in California allow some kind of sun-grown and or greenhouse cultivation. But within those, 14 of those counties have such strict restrictions that it almost is like having a ban, right? So if you're on a parcel, say, under an acre or under 5 acres, in some cases, you can't cultivate altogether, or you have to go get an onerous and expensive permit that no one's gonna get for 50 square feet of cultivation, right? So some of it's a little bit of a farce in California. And 14 counties, well, I already said that, so my bad. 4 counties throughout the California's 58 counties don't allow cultivation of any sort at all, whatsoever. Within those 4 counties, probably most of them have also banned dispensaries. So, yes, California has access depending on where you live. And that's one thing to remember about California that's really hard. So let's talk about why some of this is. So, in cultivation policy, we have moved so far away from treating this plant as a plant, as a crop that's produced for human consumption. And what regulators largely have done is they've said, oh, well, years and years of prohibition, we can't really treat this like agriculture, or maybe the thought doesn't come to them because there's more of a tendency to want to reinvent the wheel with cannabis than there is kind of looking at other models that it might fit into. So these plant count-based regulations, they are so challenging because what happens is as you limit the number of plants a cultivator can grow, they are encouraged to grow the very largest plants possible to kind of take advantage of what they're being allowed. And the longer the lifespan on these plants, the higher the risk is for pest and disease issues, the harder it is to control product quality, and product safety and product quality, it begins on the farm, right? We have to trace it all the way through the chains of custody, but the farm is where we originate with our product quality and product safety pieces. So let's look at this for example. So if I lived in LA, right, and I had 6 of these in every backyard, I think people would freak out a little bit, right? And so when we do these plant count-based models and people see this outside and they're using this type of resource indoors, it doesn't really paint a very good image of what cannabis cultivation is all about. And it's very hard to regulate, right? I can come to you and say, I'm gonna grow a plant, but you have no idea if my plant's gonna look like this and be huge, or if it's gonna be a 3-foot by 3-foot plant. There's no ability to even gauge diversion because you have no ability to gauge what the production is. So square footage models, this is how all other agricultural crops are regulated. They look at the cultivated space. I mean, I'm never gonna tell anyone if I'm an almond farmer that I have 5,000 almond trees. Department of Agriculture simply doesn't care. Right? They want to know how many acres I have. It lets them know what kind of water resources I'm going to use, how much flat space I need, what my harvest is going to be. And so that's why we're not doing that with cannabis is a mystery to me, but this is where we need to be headed. This is a farm. I don't think any of us could deny that this is a farm. This picture here is from Spain. This is a square footage-based model. These plants are not huge, but they are finishing. They're very close to finishing. This is what that looks like indoors. Right? Shorter lifespan indoors. That means each crop is using less energy, including creating less of a carbon footprint because we have less light time. These are really important things to consider because if we look at what happens indoors, we see that anywhere from 30 to 60% or more of the energy we're using is going to lighting, ventilation, air conditioning, heating, And we can eliminate that by moving outside, right? Say we just move into a greenhouse, we're going to reduce that by about 30 to 40%. And if we move into open air, we're going to reduce that by about 60%. So these are huge things to think about from my perspective. And then in 2011, we had Dr. Evan Mills, who created or wrote the study called Energy Up in Smoke, right? I think people kind of forget about this. I like to bring it up repeatedly. So U.S. cannabis production and distribution cost over $5 billion worth of energy in the U.S. in 2011, which really resulted in the emission of about 17 million tons of greenhouse gases per year. 17 million tons. That's pretty huge. That's like 3 million cars worth of emissions. So if I break that down to a kilogram of cannabis, we're talking about 2.8 tons per kilogram and 4.9 cross-country trips in a 44-mile-per-gallon car. I would love a 44-mile-per-gallon car. And so let's talk about one cigarette, right? So a lot of patients probably medicate regularly. They're going to smoke a cannabis cigarette, more than one cannabis cigarette probably per day. But each of those cannabis cigarettes, if it was cultivated indoors, is likely to have produced around 2 pounds of CO2. So you might as well just drive your car, your 44-mile-per-gallon car, 15 miles, or leave a 100-watt light bulb on for about 17 hours. This is your indoor cannabis. Okay, sorry. We'll skip that. So greenhouses and row covers. You can vastly reduce energy or CO2 emissions by moving into greenhouses and row covers. And they may or may not use artificial light. They provide multiple harvests per year. They could, require ventilation, heating, and cooling, but they're only allowed in some states. And open air or field production, which is the most environmentally friendly for many, many reasons, is really only allowed in California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and New Mexico on somewhat of a commercial level. And hopefully I didn't miss too much there. You can get 1 to 2 crops per year, depending on where you're located. And like I said, it has the lowest carbon footprint and resource consumption of cultivation. If we look at moving into greenhouses, we see that the light use is obviously oftentimes very reduced because the spacing of the lights is much farther spread out. The reason for this is we're relying on the natural sunlight to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. So these are supplemental lights. And this is kind of a classic off-the-grid greenhouse and field crop scene from Humboldt County. Humboldt County takes a lot of brunt, the whole Emerald Triangle and Northern California, I should say at this point, is taking a lot of hits for environmental degradation in relationship to cannabis cultivation. However, I'd like to point out that most of your medical cannabis providers actually really have a lot of pride in what they do as farmers. And this farm here is completely off groundwater. This greenhouse, these fans here, are run by this solar panel and this solar panel. This is a light deprivation operation here. They're going to get 2 crops out of here. They're getting ready to harvest this first crop. These plants are all small and went in secondary, so they're just going to finish in these pots. So they probably went in June or July. This I pulled off the internet because law enforcement likes to use it as an example of what's too big and not environmentally friendly in Humboldt. Really misleading. Another farming picture. So how is the message getting mixed up, right? The message is getting mixed up because there is no regulation and there's no separation between egregious environmental aspects of cannabis cultivation or farming and what's really happening on the ground in these farms. And it's really easy for media and law enforcement to kind of parade the issues that are happening largely in our National Forest Service. Or on our public lands. I think this is a great factoid because in 2013, I think it's important to note that 72% of the outdoor plants seized in California came from trespass grows, right? So when we think about raids offering the most ability for media to talk about cannabis farming, and 72% of them are from trespass grows, it's a little bit of a slanted picture. This is a trespass grow. And this is some of the concerns. If you look, it's a little bit of a hard to see picture, but all of this in here is cannabis under the canopy of the trees. It's a little bit rough to see, my apologies. But this is the kind of trash bombs that get left behind, right? People hike into our public areas, they don't bring their trash out with them, bears tear into it, and then we have trash bombs. Or we have illegal pesticides, pesticides that aren't even necessarily approved for crops that are produced for human consumption, nor are they necessarily even approved in the US. So this is Fish and Wildlife removing one of those toxic pesticides. And this is the other thing that we're always hearing about, water diversions. This is a very large illegal water diversion. All of this is happening right here in these photos on trespass grow land, national forest and timber holding. So really, why are we experiencing this? In California, California's cannabis industry is roughly worth about $2.6 billion annually. So we have this very, very valuable, unregulated crop, a very strong illicit marketplace. Public land is cheap, right? You have no mortgage, no asset forfeiture issues. The risk is very low. The odds or the chances of being picked up on public forest land, they're slim. I mean, and this is what all of the raids kind of show us. And then there's a lack of funding available for reclamation activities. And what I mean by that is once you set up one of these sites on national forest land, they can come and they can cut the plants, but unless you take out the water infrastructure, the water line, the pots, and you hike or helicopter all of that product out of the woods, these farms are ready to set right back up. Sometimes they're planted the same year again. Private lands, we do have some issues happening there. They are less, but again, we're dealing with a $2.6 billion industry that is agriculture, that is unregulated. Think about what would happen if our almonds and our grapes were unregulated in California. We would be horrified. But people are choosing to hide their cultivation by moving into rural lands, and this picture shows some pretty heavy illegal development, right? This is all tree cleared and scraped away. Not what you want to be doing if you're farming. This is kind of what these things look like on the ground. They're pretty ugly. Private illegal water diversions. This is a flat here that was cleared. I don't know if you can see the skeleton of the greenhouse up here, but these, no one reseeded this hillside, right? So we lost a lot of sediment over the course of the winter and our heavy rains. That goes into our waterways. It chokes out our fish, creates massive issues. Again, these issues are happening on private land because we don't have agricultural regulations for cannabis, which is a plant produced for human consumption. I will continue to say it. And there is a lack of farmer outreach and education, right? Farmers in California, like elsewhere, have been heavily persecuted and prosecuted, and my joke with that is that California probably has the largest population of ostriches anywhere in the world because the farmers like to put their head in the sand. And because there's no clear guidelines for them to engage, right, they don't have the ability to go get a permit to cultivate or farm cannabis or have cannabis gardens. They're pretty much afraid to seek out very basic grading and water diversion permits. And California has some of the most draconian water regulations in the entire US. They have not been enforced, even though they're draconian, they have not been enforced, not with any farming, everywhere from the Central Valley's industrial ag to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and the coastal mountain range. These permits have not been enforced until, oh my gosh, cannabis came along and now it's the big scapegoat for all of the environmental issues happening in California. So let's talk about some solutions here because we really want to be minded and move forward. Again, I'll say it one more time. Let's just regulate cannabis like agriculture because it is a crop that's produced for human consumption. And let's let the Department of Agriculture do what they do best, right? They know how to deal with crops. They know how to inspect them. They know how to look at pesticide issues, nutrient runoff, agricultural discharge, you name it. And let's move forward with implementing APA guidelines. Right? And I think this is an important one because until we put cannabis back into the place of a botanical and herbal product, we have a lot of work to do. And it's just going to keep kind of being this disconnect in our regulations and what we know as patients and providers that this plant is. And deschedule. Let's deschedule and allow the EPA to do tolerance threshold limits because we don't have any of those for cannabis. And let's get over our fear of this plant being outdoors and in the field, because the only reason why this plant is being cultivated inside First all is because of the fear of farmers. Farmers were afraid of camp activities, helicopters, prosecution, and they hid, right? They moved indoors to hide. It wasn't what was convenient, it wasn't what was better, it was a prohibition action towards hiding, right? And now that they're there, it's really easy for our regulators and our legislators to say, oh, well, we could have cannabis, medical cannabis be approved, we could even maybe have adult use cannabis. However, if we don't see it and we don't smell it, is it really there? So there's this big push to hide the cannabis production that's happening, and it's causing us dearly. This is not cannabis, right? But this here, I love this picture because this is a great California picture. This is a very prestigious winery or vineyard that has biodynamic and organic certification. It also has a sustainability certification. It has been family owned for the past 40 years, and it has all of the same land use issues that we see happen in cannabis, and I'll point them out really quickly. Ponds that were developed with excavators, steep terracing on the hillside, potentially creating an unstable slope, roads, right? But because this is so heavily regulated, right, or this is how it's perceived by the folks that are drinking the wine and the biodynamic label, and they feel really good about it, right? We aren't seeing the same kind of outrage, right? But cannabis doesn't have this to fall back on. And until we get there, we will continue to be outraged by this and this and this. So I just want to encourage folks that, we're talking about cannabis, we're farmers, right? I produce cannabis, I'm a farmer. I'm really proud to say that. And product safety starts at my farm, right? And the best medicine produced is going to be produced in a very healthy environment with very good attention paid. And it looks like Steph is ready to come up and transition. So I apologize for no questions. We ran a little over, but I want to thank you all for your patience and your attention.